Hello and welcome to Insight with political tools and beyond the headlines. Migrants used as a political weapon. Russian nuclear bombers test Europe's borders. 100,000 Russian troops mass on the Ukrainian border. These are some of the alarming headlines to have appeared over the last week, underlining the rocky relationship between East and West. This follows mounting sanctions, oil and gas shortages in Europe, a drought in Crimea, fraudulent elections followed by political clampdowns in Russia and Belarus. With a lot going on, we have our regular expert in the region, Leonid Ragozin, with us to probe and explain things. Hello and welcome, Leonid.
Hello to everyone, and Nick, thank you for having me on this event.
Well, sometimes it seems a bit like sort of deja vu. I mean, we've talked about Russian troops massing on the border, the military exercises. At the very worst, one thinks about another military intervention and some kind of invasion somewhere. It's really hard to sort of make sense of it at all. Do you how seriously does one take that? So we're going to try and go through a lot. There are a lot of stories to go through, and we're going to go through them one by one. So let's start with Belarus. For those that don't know, can you say what the president of Belarus has been up to?
President Lukashenko of Belarus has been sort of trying to stir up trouble at the border with Poland, and he's doing it in a very inventive way. I guess he followed the example of President Erdogan of Turkey somewhat. But what he did is the honorary consulate in Iraq started issuing visas en masse to the Iraqis, primarily to the Kurds. And then the same thing started happening in Syria and Yemen. And those citizens of Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, they started converging in Istanbul and then flying with Belavia, the national carrier of Belarus, to Minsk. And from there, they proceeded to the border between Belarus and the European Union, and specifically with Poland. This has been happening for some months, but the recent escalation is the biggest, because up to 8,000 migrants are now assembled at the Polish border. They're trying to break through, and the Belarusian bodyguards have been assisting them in doing so. So it's a strange situation. I mean, if it were happening during the Cold War, that would be considered like a major confrontation between two opposing blocs. But now it's looking more like a police operation and a clash between two police forces, because the bodyguards on the Polish side, they have to act like riot police. They have to basically prevent the crowd from moving on into the Polish territory. And the Belarusian bodyguards, or whoever Belarusian security agents that are present at the border, they are physically, literally pushing those refugees, who include quite a lot of women and children, into the Polish territory, and aid them in cutting the barbed wires that the Poles have installed at the border. So it's
all pretty appalling. I mean, I've read that there are cases of people freezing to death in the forests that straddle the border between Belarus and Poland. So it's pretty nasty, and I think the Poles are trying to play a sort of tough hand, not being seen to give in to Belarus. But what's behind this? Just we know that there are elections in Belarus a few months back. There have been several other instances, and the EU has introduced sanctions or escalated sanctions against Belarus.
Yeah, so indeed, there were elections in August last year, in 2020. And they were badly rigged, and of course the Alexander Lukashenko won officially, but then the opposition claimed that the main opposition candidate Tikhanovskaya won, and now she was forced into exile, and now there is a kind of a government in exile, almost, because Tikhanovskaya is recognized as the Belarusian leader by the neighboring EU countries, by Lithuania and Poland. And Lithuania and Poland sort of lead the cause of Belarusian revolution following the protests that were triggered by the presidential elections last year. So this is the reason why Lukashenko is trying to find a kind of a countermeasure, a way of forcing both Poland and Lithuania into essentially recognizing him as the only leader in Belarus. Because for now the Lukashenko's rival Tikhanovskaya, she's been received by various European leaders, and in Poland and Lithuania she's actually been treated as a leader, as a legitimate leader of the country.
It's interesting in that Poland has got its own spat with Brussels over the judiciary and essentially some political interference in the judiciary, and Poland is being sanctioned with a threat of money being withdrawn from the EU. So how's that played out? You've got sort of two. It's interesting that the EU has got to come to Poland's defense, very obviously, in this situation.
Well, that's the most interesting and most paradoxical part of the story. There are two dimensions in the story. One dimension is geopolitical, and of course everybody is sort of talking about it in terms of the new Cold War. There is East and there is West, and because our mindset is formed by the 20th century history, it's very easy for us to explain things in these terms. But there's the other 21st century dimension in the story, which is the wave of far-right politics and authoritarian politics everywhere around the world, including the United States of America, and partly including Britain. But in Eastern Europe, it's a major trend. And Vladimir Putin is a classic far-right politician with the person who supports traditional values, the so-called, and the person who promotes homophobia, who is creating this new nationalist mythology for Russia, which is radically different from the Soviet mythology, although he's trying to incorporate elements of the Soviet.
Sticking with Belarus, I guess the point is that Belarus is a very close Russian ally, and they've
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But what I was intended to say is that Poland is undergoing a very similar transition, which Russia underwent maybe 15 or 10 years ago, with the government in the far-right government in Poland becoming increasingly authoritarian, and its headlines coming from Poland, especially this year, read like headlines from Russia 10 or 15 years ago. The latest thing they did, which precipitated the crisis with the European Union, is they consult for provisions in the European Union Treaty and put their own constitution, their own laws above this European Union Treaty, which is exactly the same thing that Vladimir Putin did in 2019 at the referendum, when he made Russians vote for the sort of declaration that Russian law is above any international agreements that Russia has signed to. But there is more: the treatment of the media, the demise of independent judiciary in Poland, loads and loads of similarities. So we have those two regimes that are getting closer, in the way they are organized and in the way they are treating the opposition. And there is a lot of similarity between those two regimes.
Interpreting what Belarus is doing, essentially, Belarus wouldn't be doing that without Russia's backing in some way or other. And we've seen, Belarus, there is a military and financial agreement between the two countries. And in my introduction, I talked about the Russian jets flying into Belarusian airspace, but basically as a sort of showing direct military support for Belarus. So that needling of the EU, needling of Poland, is something that it has Russia's hand behind it.
Well, yes and no. Belarus is indeed an ally to Russia, and Belarusian regime is harsher than Russian regime. And this is why the uprising happened following the elections in Belarus last year. People were fed up with a government that was even more repressive than the one in the neighboring Russia. However, it doesn't mean that, as many people many experts often say, that Lukashenko is simply a puppet of Putin, a puppet of the Kremlin. On the contrary, Lukashenko has been all through his almost 30 years in power, he has been promoting. His policy was quite independent from Russia.
Put the question another way: what has been Putin's response to Lukashenko's use of the migrants?
Russia remained quiet for some time. There were the usual statements from the Russian Foreign Ministry, which are best described by the word trolling. They enjoy when the West, and especially countries like Poland and Lithuania, suffer and don't know what to do. There was a lot of Schadenfreude there, and a lot of trolling indeed. What happened later is interesting, and I'm not sure about the causes of it, but Russia did send two nuclear-capable bombers to fly over the Belarusian and Polish border in a show of force, and then more recently, in the last few hours, actually, there was a small-scale exercise held, a joint exercise of Belarusian and Russian paratroopers who were parachuted near the Polish border, and there was a terrible incident there as well. Two Russian soldiers died while being parachuted. So there were deaths, unfortunately. Well, anyway, Russia has shown that it's conducting some kind of military activities near the Polish border, and that feeds very much into the Polish government's narrative. That it's not just the migrants, or it's not just the conflict with Belarus. It's a major, conflict of clash of civilizations.
Yeah, I don't get this at all. This is part of my major confusion. Is at the same time, okay, the EU is asking, European states are asking Russia to increase oil and gas supplies, or gas supplies, and the critical thing for Russia is that they want the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to go ahead. And as we speak, there are coalition negotiations going on between the Greens and the Social Democrats. And the Greens, one of their key things for part of that coalition is not to have Nord Stream 2. So why would you be rattling the saber at this time? I just don't get it.
Yeah, it is. It seems like a very sophisticated game that both, or actually multiple sides in this crisis are playing, and gas is of course one of the major dimensions. Yes, Russia is interested in Nord Stream 2 pipeline up and running as soon as possible. This is partly due to Russia's interest in kind of suffocating Ukrainian economy, because Nord Stream means less transit through the Ukrainian territory. And if Nord Stream 2 is operable, starts gas supplies begin before the start of the proper winter in Ukraine, then there is a chance that Russia can sort of reduce supplies of gas to Ukraine and make Ukraine freeze.
Yeah, I find it very confusing, because you'd have thought the moment that the Kremlin and Putin, he's in a very strong position. He said, I'll increase gas supplies, and read behind that, you need to give me a few concessions here and there. So why would you be dropping parachutists on the Polish border at the same time? I don't get it. Okay, let's step back a bit. What's the situation now with Putin's popularity in Russia? And I mean, I partly asked that question because the saber rattling, if you think back to Crimea was enormously popular as the invasion of Crimea proved to be enormously popular among the Russian electorate. But I just wonder how this kind of thing plays out now with the Russian electorate and what Putin's popularity is at the moment. And bear in mind, economic crisis, COVID, Russia's, but let's start with that. How has COVID been in Russia?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you say you're confused, and I totally understand. And many people are confused about this whole situation. But that doesn't mean that, that doesn't mean that Putin is not confused. I think we find Putin and the Kremlin in a very confused state.
Yeah,
this is
expecting to be rational too.
Yeah, this is because of what you have just mentioned. Yes. The Kremlin played this irredentist card very masterfully when they occupied Crimea, and they evoked this sense of kind of justice being made, and people being liberated who didn't want to live in Ukraine. So his popularity soared in 2014 when Russia occupied Crimea. And that phenomenon, which sociologists call Crimea bubble, it lingered till 2018 when it burst. The reason for it bursting was the pension reform, which was a way for Putin to pay for this geopolitical adventure of seizing Crimea, and which was followed by Western sanctions. So his popularity dropped, not drastically, but dropped back to pre-Crimean levels, which is a very difficult situation for Putin, because Putin has always been a majoritarian leader. He was not a democratic leader, but it was quite clear from opinion polls that he has always represented the majority. The reason why Crimea happened is that before Crimea, a couple of years before Crimea, there were the Bolotnaya protests, and gradually his popularity rating was going down to 50%, which is where he stops being a majoritarian leader. He can't claim to be supported by the majority. And a very similar situation is happening now. Problem for Putin is that there is no other Crimea. They're trying to invent something, not necessarily in terms of occupying other countries. The latest attempt was with major infrastructural developments and refashioning the outlooks of cities from sort of Soviet to more modernized and European outlook. But really, they're not achieving anything similar to Crimea effect for now, which is why all the hectic movements, and which is why a major wave of repression in Russia this year, something that was unthinkable in previous years and totally unthinkable 10 years ago.
Right, and some people saying that Russia really is as repressive as it was at the end of the Soviet era, and more people in jail than that period as well, which is
well, actually, today's Russia is more repressive than any time during the late Soviet era, during Brezhnev, for the vegetarian period of the Soviet Union. It wasn't particularly repressive and wasn't really totalitarian. So yes, it is. We are living through a very volatile period in Russia.
So then, Leonid, I mean, I'm jumping the gun slightly. Does that when you see these maneuvers taking place, this is not just posturing. This is something that could go wrong, but also you think that Russia might miscalculate. There's a possibility of that.
Yes, it can miscalculate. the main danger with Russia is that much of what they do, there is sort of an illusion in the West, and it's a dangerous illusion that Russia is doing things according to plan. Whereas in reality, there's a lot of improvisation, including what they did in Ukraine. There is, of course, Russia is a superpower. There is always a plan lying somewhere in the general staff of, occupying this and that country, of Poland, of Hungary, of Kiribati in Polynesia, because it's a superpower. It's ready. It has a plan of some kind of military action. But in terms of political decisions, most of what they do is improvisation. And Mark Galeotti has coined an excellent term, adhocracy.
Adhocracy, just so who Mark Galeotti is.
Mark Galeotti is a sort of major Russia expert and who authored some of the best books on current Russia and Russian history. And like anytime you have a chance to read him, do so. They're improvising, and in this act of improvisation, especially when we are going deeper and deeper into crisis, and these are people who, just like everybody else who are dealing with this crisis, they have no experience in dealing with it. They don't know what to do, and they are aging people who have been in power for the last 20 years. They're getting older. They're not as bright as they used to be. So the possibility of mistakes is quite high, I think.
Okay, I'm going to come back to Crimea, and I'm going to come back to Donetsk as well, and talk about the Russian military in just a second. But let's put one to one side. I want to talk about Moldova, and then I want to talk about Ukraine. I know this is added layers of complexity, but I think it's good just to try and cover the whole lot. What's been going on with Moldova? How's Gazprom and Moldova have been trying to negotiate over a contract there? Why is that interesting?
It developed like a major drama, and all the usual commentators, especially on Twitter, were trying to present it again as, a major episode in the clash of civilizations between the civilized West and the barbaric Russia. The issue was over the gas contract with Moldova, the supplies of gas. The sort of prehistory was that the European Union has been moving away from traditional contracts with Gazprom and away from the dependence on Russian gas. For that reason, they promoted what they call spot trade. They didn't want long-term contracts, which was...
You're talking about the Moldovan government, so spot trading to try and get better. I'm
coming to Moldovan government.
Okay.
This is now about European Union, but Moldova, Ukraine, and other neighboring countries, the countries of the so-called European Partnership zone, they were following the same sort of patterns as the European Union. They were under pressure from European Union. So in short, they moved away to lessen their dependence on Russian gas. European Union countries and their allies east of the European Union, they tried to move away from long-term contracts with Russia towards getting more gas. More gas when they need it on short-term contracts. And then what happened is that they were hoping for the liquefied gas from the United States and Qatar, but there was increased demand in Asia, and this gas was diverted to Asia. And what they were left with is Gazprom and the Russian government, which didn't break any contracts, didn't reduce the supply of gas, but they simply didn't have those contracts. So it was, and then they realized that winter is coming and there is not enough gas in the storages. So it became a general issue and a general headache all over Europe, really. And Moldova was one of those countries. So it held desperate negotiations, and a lot of harsh and radical things were said during the negotiations. But then eventually the deal was struck between Russia and Moldova. And Moldova said that, officially said that the deal was struck on Moldovan terms, but then unofficially, as Western publications ran it from sources in Moldovan government, it turns out that it was more on the Russian terms. But anyway, Moldova is safe now. They are going to get the gas.
Yeah, I guess the underlying thing behind it is that, with the gas supply. I mean, Moldova is a tiny country. It's interested in EU membership, and I think the story being run was that the conditions were, basically you need to slow down on your association agreement with the EU and that moves towards EU membership, and that was one of the suggestions.
No, exactly. There were political provisions in the agreement, and yes, it does slow down the integration of this country with the European Union.
Okay, let's move on and let's go to Ukraine. Remind us what Zelensky has been trying to do. This is the former comedian, the star of the TV series, who became president and then got embroiled in the dispute with Trump. Well, not with Trump directly, but Ukraine got implicated in the impeachment hearings in some way. But things have moved on since then. What's he trying to do at the moment?
Zelensky was elected in 2019. He won the election by a landslide, defeated the incumbent, Petro Poroshenko, who ran on the ethno-nationalist card. Zelensky ran on sort of unifying platform. And what happened in a country that is quite polarized geographically between the Ukrainian-speaking West and the Russian-speaking East, Zelensky appeared to be this unifying figure. Both the East and the West voted for him. And one of the main promises in his platform was peace with Russia. So people voted for that as well. But then years went by and there was no peace with Russia. The conflict in the east of Ukraine, which began in 2014, it's still simmering. The soldiers die every now and then on both sides. Zelensky started by talking to Putin. They met in Normandy with the mediation of Germany and France. It felt like a really promising start, but then this whole progress evaporated gradually. There was no progress, and you could feel that Putin, the Kremlin, starting to feel more nervous and more disappointed with Zelensky. The other layer in this whole story was how Trump administration was trying to use Zelensky for his domestic purposes, and it was trying, with the help of Zelensky, was trying to get Zelensky on board in Trump's campaign for the discreditation of Joe Biden. And this is, of course, because Biden's son was working in Ukraine in a company with dodgy partners representing the previous regime. So there was that complicated.
One of Zelensky's big drives was to clamp down on corruption. I mean, all Ukrainian leaders have said this, and the reality has been somewhat different. But he has tried to curb the power of the oligarchs with legislation in parliament, but that also has hit hurdles.
Yeah, well, exactly. Zelensky couldn't really move and do anything in Ukraine until Trump was gone. And then when Trump was gone, when Biden administration came to power, suddenly Zelensky went on offensive. And uh, uh, he kind of, he completely changed tack. First of all, in relations with Russia, he became almost belligerent. And then second, he went on oligarchs, but not on all the oligarchs. He went against those oligarchs that were advocating closer ties with Russia, but not against the oligarchs who, I would say, who are officially on the list of sponsors of Atlantic Council, the NATO's main tank. So there were two major oligarchs, Kolomoisky and Medvedchuk. Medvedchuk is very closely related to Vladimir Putin. They're friends, they're indirect relatives, and Zelensky's Security Council using sort of non-constitutional powers, using the decrees of the Security Council, not through the parliament or anything like that. The president started clamping down on both of these oligarchs, and first of all on Medvedchuk. Why it matters is that oligarchs are the people who control media in Ukraine. And media, especially television, is by controlling television, you basically control swathes of electorate. And in post-Soviet countries, this is really, really important. So by clamping down on Medvedchuk, by starting a criminal case against him, he also managed to shut down two of major television channels in Ukraine that promoted not so much a pro-Russian point of view, but definitely a point of view that was alternative to what the pro-Western, particularly pro-American part of Ukrainian political elite have been promoting. So Zelensky finds himself suddenly, despite being elected on as a potential peacemaker, as a person who was suspected in the United States in particular of sympathies to Russia, he suddenly becomes an enemy of Russia and an enemy of Putin, and somebody with whom Putin probably is not going to talk anymore.
Things can get pretty nasty. There was a recent, it looks like an assassination attempt on one of his advisors. And then I also want to talk about you as well. Reporting in Ukraine can be difficult. It's a very febrile environment. Let's talk about violence first of all, that attempted assassination or shooting, and then we'll come on to you.
Yes. One of the aides to President Zelensky, the person who is advising him on main foreign policy issues and domestic policy issues, he was indeed attacked. He was moving in the car, and the car was came under fire, but he escaped and wasn't hurt. So that was one of those strange criminal events that happen in Ukraine from time to time, and they started happening after Maidan Revolution. There was a series of assassinations, only one of which was properly solved, but all the others weren't. Some of the persons who were assassinated were pro-Russian politicians or journalists. Others were not. The most the most important of those assassinations was the murder of Pavel Sherman, a very prominent Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian journalist. He has this triple identity, but he was quite clearly a supporter of Maidan revolution. He was very respected by the democratic and pro-Western forces in Ukraine and by the Western partners of Ukraine. He died in a car bombing act, and all fingers were pointed at Russia on day one, on minute one, when it happened. But then the official investigation was stalled for many years until President Poroshenko was defeated by Zelensky in the elections, and only under Zelensky some suspects were arrested who had nothing to do with Russia, but they came from the nationalist and far-right circles in Ukraine, and who were veterans of the war between Russia and Ukraine, who have been to the front line, and they fought there. I got involved lately with the journalistic investigation of Pavel Sherman's murder, working for the Ukrainian outlet called Zabarona, and for the money of Justice for Journalists, an international NGO.
Yeah, this is the thing, because this is, I mean, we did a program partly on that assassination. I think it was just over a year ago we did that. But the follow-up, because you were involved in the reporting on that, what's happened to you?
Well, the latest thing that happened to me is, first of all, things happened to my partners in Ukraine. At one point, a major sort of media personality who wants to be called a journalist, but he's a spin doctor. He published the photograph of the young child and their house on Facebook. This is dangerous because there were precedents when
this is the reporter's child and their home.
Yeah, the reporter's child and their home. There were occasions when doxing stories like this led to actual assassinations after Maidan. So they had to leave the country and stay out of Ukraine for some months and return some.
Yeah. And when it came to you, I mean, the usual thing was you're Russian, so therefore you're a Russian spy.
Well, in my case, what happened is an info war.
I always thought you remember the SVR. I was convinced.
An info war website in Ukraine connected to the previous presidency, to Poroshenko, published a story dedicated entirely to me, saying that I'm a Russian spy because I studied English at school, which no other children, according to them, studied in the Soviet Union, and because I worked in travel business, because I worked as a translator. It was all about English language. But then the main accusation was that I worked for the BBC for 12 years, and of course, if you're Russian and you get a job in the BBC, then you gotta be a spy. Unfortunately, this is all funny, but unfortunately, they also doxed the address of my sort of close family, elderly and vulnerable people, in this story, which was published in 11 languages. There was a huge wave of condemnation from Western journalists working in the region and elsewhere. Yeah. So on that front, it was quite good. It was almost like birthday. So many people saying good things about me. But yeah, it's hard to live when your sort of family finds. Yeah, when you find your family in the line of fire. Yeah. So
Yeah, no, not pleasant. Well, listen, I'd love to get some questions. We're going to go back, talk about Crimea. We're going to talk about the Russian military and how that's changing in just a second. But let's just bring in one or two questions if we can. Please put your questions in the Q&A box below. Thank you very much, Leonid. It's a very thorough overview. It's complex. There's a lot going on. So I've got Lucy Eggleton in front of me, so I don't know if we can open a microphone, but I have a sneaky feeling it might actually be my mother disguised as Lucy Eggleton. So go ahead, whoever's there. Go on. Yeah, you can hear you, yes.
I've got two questions. There's so much going on that Leonid has talked about. Are they all joined together, or do we see the Polish border migrant question as a separate issue and the gas as another issue, and what's going on with the oligarchs in Ukraine as another issue? How should we view it?
I'll have to go metaphoric here. Basically, it's natural that most people see conflicts like this as two-dimensional. One country, in this case Russia, attacking Ukraine, and various situations arise because of this. However, unfortunately, and that's why the whole thing sounds so confusing, this story has many different dimensions, where we're talking about a very multidimensional multidimensional model, or I would dare to say quantum physics in journalism and political science. It does sound very complicated. You can't get away from it. So yes, answering your questions, yes, all those stories are interconnected, very much so. But the way they're interconnected is most convoluted.
Yeah. Okay. So it's difficult. Okay. Thank you for that question. If people have got more questions, please put them down in the Q&A box. This moves me sideways. I want to talk a bit more about the sort of Russian military strength and what has changed in the past few years. I mean, if we roll back the clock to 2007, 2008, Georgia. While that was a defeat for Georgia, it was seen as a pretty much not a very messy Russian operation, and huge changes were introduced in the Russian military as a result of that. So now I'm aware of the Wagner Group having significant presence in the Central African Republic, places like potentially in Mali. And then also the reforms actually within the Russian military itself. Can you give us just an idea of how the Russian military has changed in the last decade? And that's a big question, I know.
Yes, there was what we see with the Russian military is the gradual transition to hybrid war operations. The way it is pictured in the Western media is almost like the Russians have invented hybrid war. The way I see it, or way it looks from the Russian perspective, is that they have been copycatting the Americans for a long time, as with pretty much everything. So the Americans have Blackwater. It's not called Blackwater, it's called the Academy or whatever. They keep changing those names. But there was this private army that was heavily involved in the operations in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and it became notorious because of extrajudicial killings and various dirty operations that they were doing on behalf of the American command. So the Russians during the war in Ukraine, they came up with a similar unit, which is run by somebody called Evgeny Prigozhin, who is well, you could call him an oligarch, but really he's a businessman who comes from Putin's old history in St. Petersburg. He's not a major oligarch. He's He has contracts with the Kremlin and with the Education Ministry in Russia for catering in various establishments, in various institutions, which is why he's called Putin's chef. Somehow he was in charge of catering for Putin during high-profile visits, like Merkel coming to St. Petersburg. So that's his reputation. So he came to be known for two reasons. One reason is his private army, which became known as Wagner Group. Why Wagner is because the person in charge, the actual military guy in charge, Sergei Utkin, he's a person of far-right convictions. He's a Nazi essentially, and he's into dark German music, and his friends call him Wagner. That's why the kind of people he assembled around himself. Many of them also belong to neo-Nazi groups in St. Petersburg. I met with a couple of these guys before they joined Wagner. The most well-known person I met is called Alexei Melchikov. He was a young neo-Nazi in St. Petersburg. He's a sadist, essentially.
Okay, so let's. I got a question from Simon Eggleton, who happens to be married to Lucy Eggleton, who's in front of me there. So I'm going to open the same microphone. So Simon, are you there?
Nicholas, good evening.
Yeah. So can you ask your question, because this comes off the back of this and the Wagner Group?
Yes, it's a follow-on, and it's slightly before the Wagner Group, I guess, came to prominence. But in the initial fighting in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, there was speculation that they were actually serving Russian military special forces in their black uniforms with all their patches taken off, but they were actually operating in Ukraine. And this worked very well for Putin. He was able to get away with it, basically. So the question is, would he do it again? Or do you think the West is on to him now and it couldn't happen?
Yes, the invasion in Crimea started as this kind of hybrid operation where military people, very well equipped in new uniforms, started taking positions at various infrastructural objects and military units in Ukraine, and they didn't identify themselves as the Russian army. So the way journalists and locals in Crimea started calling them was the little green men. And the uniforms was actually green, not black. So they became known as green men. Yes, this sort of hybrid war manner of conducting military operations like this, in which the attacking side is basically trying to avoid confrontation, is basically trying to avoid bloodshed. So it is conducting the war by other means, in which propaganda plays a major role. From a purely military point of view, the Crimean operations was a major success. There was almost no bloodshed at all in this whole operation. Almost nobody died. And then they tried a kind of a similar operation in Donbass, in the east of Ukraine. No, it didn't work like this. The Ukrainian army managed to reorganize themselves. They started defending, and then a fully fledged war started in the east of Ukraine. Is Russia planning something similar in future? I mean, there are of course many experts who know how to read Putin's mind. So there's this cliche: Putin has this or that on his mind. He's planning this or that. I can't read Putin's mind, to be honest, and I'm not sure how insane or not insane this mind is at this stage.
Yeah.
I don't see the appetite in Russian society for any adventures like Crimea at all. It will be very, very hard to sell it to Russian society. But selling it to Russian society, increasing his popularity ratings is his own motive, really. He is not conquering the world. He's saving himself as the ruler of Russia.
That's a really good point, the last bit. We've got Diane Cook. If we can bring up Diane to ask a follow-up question to that. While we're bringing up Diane, I mean, crime in Crimea, Putin was very popular, but it faces huge infrastructure problems now. There's the main water supply came from within Ukraine, and although the Russians have built a bridge coming from the east, they don't have a water supply, do they? So there's some real, and that's just one of the many problems they're facing there.
No, that's true. The Ukrainians stopped water supply, so Russians had to be inventive, and they had to start all sorts of infrastructural projects in Crimea to provide water, first of all, but also electricity, and also to maintain transport links with Russia. And for that purpose, they built this huge bridge across the Straits of Kerch, which now connects Crimea to the mainland Russia.
But I mean, let's bring up Diane Cook's question, and then I'm going to talk about Blinken as well, who's been giving warnings to the Kremlin. Go ahead, Diane.
First of all, I just want to say, Leonid, it's been fascinating listening to you as ever. It's very concise and very to the point. My question is, how worried should I be that there's some awful miscalculation on the Belarusian-Polish border with what's going on at the moment? I mean, I noticed that I read somewhere that, or saw a news flash that I think the British have sent some troops to assist with goodness knows what. But given that we're not in the EU, I guess they've gone under NATO.
I think a simple answer to your question would be that yes, it's sensible to be worried. I'm worried as well. We live in this kind of strange postmodernist world in which superpowers and various actors on the world stage, they are kind of cosplaying the Cold War. There is a lot of element, and there is a lot of effort to make things seem like a major confrontation between opposite, ideological blocks and almost opposite civilizations. However, the two sides are infinitely more similar to each other than they used to be during the Cold War. And there is a major simulative element. The words that are being said, those ground words about clash of civilizations, it doesn't match the reality on the ground. But yet you can see those words being gradually translated into action. Escalation is going on, and as you correctly said, there is a British engineering unit has been deployed at the Polish border to assist the Polish border guards in preventing the refugees from spilling into Poland. So in the very least, yes, we can talk about a humanitarian catastrophe because it's 8,000 people in the cold during the winter. Essentially, there is snow there, and two sides that are both quite brutal. The way Polish border guards have been treating the refugees is not nice. The way Belarusians are treating them is not nice either. Yes, something can happen. And then, of course, yes, Poland is a NATO country, and other NATO countries like Britain are sending reinforcements there. And Belarus is an ally of Russia. not just an ally of Russia. There is an entity called the Union of Russia and Belarus. It's mostly on paper, but in theory, Russia and Belarus is one union state, as they call themselves officially. So if something happens, by definition, by default, sorry, Russia will have to intervene. So there is a potential for a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO on that border, and it is a situation that requires very, very special attention. However, we were seeing today signs of it being diffused gradually, because the Belarusians announced that they have stopped issuing visas in Iraq. The Belarusian national carrier also announced that it's not going to put on its flights the residents of Yemen, Iraq, and Syria unless they are diplomats. So it's at least Belarus, it seems, is not going to receive more of those refugees.
Okay, and just to interrupt, Turkey also, I think, said that it's not flying people to Minsk.
Yeah, exactly. And the European Union in previous days, it threatened Turkish Airways and Aeroflot with sanctions for flying those people into Minsk. So, yeah. Also, I mean, outside Belarus, there were really, really radical statements by Secretary Blinken and by the Americans in general when they said, first of all, they said that Belarus, they called it a potential front line. And they also said in plain words that Russia, which has been amassing troops around Ukraine in previous months, that the word they use is rehashing Crimea. They might be sort of attempting to rehash Crimea. Yes, there is a lot of brinkmanship going on, brinkmanship is getting more and more worrying.
Got a completely different question, but a very important question nevertheless. Does Putin have any intention of trying to reduce fossil fuel usage? Does he care about climate change? This is from Hilary Matthews.
Yes, that's a very good question. I must admit I wasn't really following the story, but what I can say from reading other journalists is that there was a major shift in Putin's stance, because, as I said, Putin has employed much of the rhetorics that is being used by the right wingers and the far right in the West, also on the subject of climate change. His government was essentially a government of climate skeptics, and they had a good reasons. They run this, fossil fuel empire. They're not interested in those green energy projects at all. However, this year we can see that yes, Putin, at least rhetorically, has changed tack. He admits that it is important to reduce carbon imprint. Is he doing something about it? Well, what I'm seeing on the ground in Russia is that in Moscow, which is a major a global sort of capital of 12 million people, the buses are being gradually replaced with electric buses. There is a plan to phase out fossil fuel, gasoline buses until 2027, I think. There are green energy projects in Russia, and there's this discourse as well in Russia about the country losing this gold mine, partly because it would naturally run out of fossil fuel, but of major resources of fossil fuel, but partly also because of this shift to green energy in Western countries. So this is being discussed in the Kremlin, outside the Kremlin. There's this public discourse that exists in Russia.
I'm going to add, I think, when it comes to methane, the world's largest methane leaks are taking place in Russia at this very, very moment. So it's and a lot of pressure on Russia to try and sort that out. Leonid, thank you so much. I'm hoping you can stay with us. We will have a chat, a brief chat just after the hour after the break. But I just want to thank you so much for a very, very comprehensive overview. And also you're very precise. You're very careful about what you say. No huge generalization. So thank you very much indeed for that. It's been really worthwhile.
No, thank you, Nick. Has been a pleasure. And I'll stay for the chat. I'll just get myself a glass of water.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you very much, Leonid.